Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're actually stepping away from the frontline trenches and the flashy tactical maneuvers of combat to look at something much, much bigger. We're going to examine the massive, completely hidden systems that actually determine the outcome of wars. We're talking about operational logistics. It's the battle behind the battle. And as we'll see, it is often where conflicts are won or lost before a single shot is even fired. You know, it's really easy to look at a frontline soldier and just think about their training or their raw courage. But I want you to consider this fundamental question. What actually keeps that soldier fighting? Amateurs often focus solely on frontline combat, but today we're going to look at the highly vulnerable logistical tail stretching for hundreds of miles behind that soldier. Because without it, well, the whole shebang just collapses.
Okay, let's dive into this. Think of this as your syllabus for today's military classroom. First, the logistics chain. Second, the mountain challenge. Third, severe equipment shortages. Fourth, the last mile problem. Fifth, the air supply lifeline. And finally, prepared versus reactive systems.
All right, starting with part 1, the logistics chain, or as it's better known, the lifeline of an army. Just imagine the journey of a single bullet, or maybe a winter coat, moving through this system. It's manufactured in a factory, stored in a depot, transported by road, loaded onto an air transport, carried by a human porter until it finally, hopefully, reaches that frontline soldier. It's a highly fragile chain of custody, and every single link absolutely must hold. Moving on to part 2, the mountain challenge. This is where we really stress test the system. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer backbreaking human effort required just to move a single vehicle. The terrain in the mountainous regions of this 1962 conflict featured incredibly steep, unforgiving gradients. Road transport was severely inadequate, really weak. Once you pushed past the newly constructed roads, movement forward was restricted entirely to hill ponies and men on foot, literally dragging supplies up the mountain. To put that into perspective, imagine a brutal 350-kilometer stretch from Missouri to Thoglaw with absolutely zero camping or trooping arrangements. None. Formations had to be entirely self-sufficient. Add in incessant rain, slippery paths, and freezing weather, and you have troops forced to bivouac right out in the open. Before they even faced an enemy, this total lack of shelter and waterproof gear became a severe health hazard, threatening to deplete fighting units through pulmonary illnesses alone. Which brings us to part 3, severe equipment shortages. An army wildly under-equipped. 60,000. I want that staggering number to really sink in for a second. That is the number of rifles the Indian Army was short. Because of this massive deficit, troops were forced to rely on .303 rifles that had actually seen action before World War I. Meanwhile, the opposing forces were rolling in with modern machine guns, heavy mortars, and automatic rifles. And it doesn't stop there. The shortages completely cascaded across all critical equipment categories. We're talking 700 anti-tank guns missing, 5,000 radio sets short, and a combined efficiency of 20,000 one-ton and 3-ton transport trucks. 2 whole regiments of tanks were non-operational simply from a lack of spare parts. All of this was compounded by massive financial constraints, where the government refused to import weapons, trying to avoid an economic setback by insisting on indigenous production. Plus, the General Staff Reserve policy rigidly held to a 6-month stock limit. That was a timeline based on old British industrial capacity that completely failed to match the actual realities of their own supply chain. All right, part 4. The last mile problem. This is exactly where the chain breaks. Let's move to how this builds, because when the roads literally run out, survival relies on the sky. Supplies go from the aircraft down to a drop zone, then to local porters, and finally out to the forward posts. Now, these porters were absolutely essential because they were locals, fully acclimatized to the altitude, but they were often completely unavailable the moment the first exchange of fire happened. It created a massive, immediate bottleneck. Now, what's really interesting about this next point is the brutal math behind it. 5 kilograms. Because the terrain and bitter cold were so extreme, a porter's turnaround time could easily be 4 to 5 days. To survive that trek, the porter had to carry their own 4 to 5 days of rations plus heavy clothing and bedding. By the time you account for the gear they needed just to stay alive, their effective payload, the actual supplies they could deliver to the frontline troops, was reduced to a meager 5 kilograms in some cases. Talk about the law of diminishing returns in action, right? So, part 5, the air supply lifeline.
a totally haphazard system. Get a load of this failure rate. On average, 30 to 40% of airdrop parachutes just didn't open. It resulted in total losses of the vital supplies attached to them. And why? Unbelievably, it was because of a policy to retrieve and reuse old parachutes just to save a few bucks. These parachutes would lie out in the freezing open for months, get hauled 150 kilometers back by mules, and be roughly patched up. Trying to save money on parachutes resulted in a massive waste of precious air effort and completely unpredictable supply drops. Just a glaring example of misplaced economy. And honestly, even when the drops succeeded, the disconnect between logistics planners and frontline reality was shocking. The Army was literally airdropping massive 44-gallon drums of kerosene. Think about that for a second. Try to imagine freezing troops hauling a heavy, sloshing 44-gallon drum up a steep 13,000-foot incline. It was physically impossible. What they desperately needed were manageable 4-gallon jerry cans. The devastating human cost of this entire logistical breakdown was summarized grimly by Lieutenant General B.M. Call on October 7th at Dola. His report paints an absolutely horrifying picture. Battalions with only 3 days of rations left, just 50 rounds of small arms ammunition per man. And tragically, troops stationed at 15,000 feet in the middle of severe cold, equipped only in summer uniforms with a single blanket.
Finally, Part 6. Prepared versus reactive. The ultimate cost.
So the crucial point we have to take away is the stark contrast. On one side, you have the Indian Army operating a reactive supply system, highly erratic, underfunded, reliant on airdrops in terrible weather, and constantly starved of basic equipment. On the other side, the Chinese Army operated a prepared supply system. They had thoroughly stockpiled supplies in Tibet and maintained the massive manpower necessary to keep their front lines consistently well supplied. Logistical readiness in the mountains requires meticulous, long-term planning, not just scrambling ad hoc reactions. And that leaves us with this absolute finality. Amateurs discuss battles, professionals study sustainment. The fate of armies isn't just decided by bravery on the field. It's dictated by the totally unglamorous work of parachutes, kerosene cans, and winter blankets. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. I want to leave you with a critical question to consider. If a modern army were sent into these exact mountains tomorrow, would their hidden supply lines hold, or would they freeze just the same?